This video is brought to you by the subscribe button.
Hello and welcome to Game & Browse. Today we're going to be talking about a game that takes place in a beloved sci-fi universe. That's right, I'm talking about Pikmin 2.
Good news, everyone! I've got a better game for us to play.
Actually, we already have a game to play.
Oh, just play it.
There are times in cinematic history when a television show will come along and captivate audiences with its characters and story. Sometimes, however, these shows will be inexplicably stricken from the lineup and pulled off the air, leaving behind a cult following in a classic case of what if? Shows like Firefly and Freaks and Geeks are some of the programs that come to mind. Futurama is another show that fits the canceled prematurely description. The show is regarded as some of creator Matt Groening's finest work. It blends peak Simpsons-level comedy and sci-fi with a memorable cast headed by Billy West, John DiMaggio, and Katie Sagal. The show is known for having 3 separate runs during its lifespan, with the show's initial debut on Fox from 1999 to 2003, a 2008 revival that was released as 4 direct-to-video movies before later being rebroadcast on Comedy Central, and finally a second revival in 2010 that would once again run on Comedy Central until 2013. With the end of its original run on Fox came the release of the one and only home console game adaptation of Futurama, aptly named Futurama the Game. The game was developed by now-defunct Swedish developer UDS and published by Vivendi Universal under their Fox Interactive label. It was released for the Sony PlayStation 2 and Microsoft Xbox on August 1st, 2003 for PAL regions, and slightly later on August 12th for North America. Futurama the Game also planned to have a release on the current Nintendo consoles at the time, but this version of the game wouldn't come to fruition, leaving Futurama exclusively on the Xbox and PS2. A combination of poor sales figures and the show's strong cult following make this game an expensive title for collectors of both systems.
While production of the video game started before the cancellation of the television show, Futurama the Game wouldn't be released until the end of Futurama the show's initial run on the Fox network. As such, many refer to the cutscenes in the game as Futurama's Lost Episode or The Lost Adventure, because the game's cutscenes, when put together, equate one new episode of Futurama. Both the gameplay and the cutscenes for Futurama the Game are presented in a 3D cel-shaded style. It's also worth noting that all of the original voice actors from the television show reprise their vocal roles for the video game, which really makes this game feel like an authentic episode of Futurama.
I'm back, baby.
Now, I've had this game in my collection since I was a kid, but for the life of me, prior to this playthrough, I could not remember a thing about it.
Why was that? Well, having just watched Aaron play through the entirety of the game, I now remember why I couldn't recall any of it. I had repressed it. That's because the gameplay for Futurama the Game is not good.
The Simpsons has had its fair share of clunkers, but there were also some very well-produced Simpsons licensed titles. The arcade beat-em-up game from Konami and The Simpsons Hit and Run come to mind, so it's more than possible to make a good Futurama game in the vein of those games we mentioned, right?
Well, I was wrong.
Let's start from the very beginning. In Futurama the Game, you get to play as Fry, Bender, and Leela. Each character brings their own play style to the table. Fry has some mixed third-person shooter elements, Bender is more platforming focused, and Leela's gameplay is centered around martial arts combat. There's even a short segment where you get to play as Dr. Zoidberg in a one-off obstacle avoidance minigame.
The game starts off with Fry's part of the story, in which you learn that Professor Farnsworth has elected to sell off Planet Express to Mom. Right away, you get to see how well the humor fits in with the game, just like its television counterpart.
Ah, this bends.
Oh, Fuff! It's not like this is the end of the world as we know it.
This is the end of the world as we know it.
As you could imagine, the sale of Planet Express has dire implications, giving Mom majority control of the world's population and allowing her to enact mass slavery. As a result, the Planet Express crew decides to escape Earth, but not before learning that their ship is inexplicably wrecked. This is where the gameplay kicks in, because Fry's first mission is to collect tools around the Planet Express headquarters to repair the ship. This also allows for the clever introduction of the respawn system. The game actually has this mechanic canonically written into the story. When Fry finds the hammer, a massive pile of junk ends up falling on him, crushing Fry in the process. Thankfully, Farnsworth comes to the rescue with his newly invented Reanimator, a giant toaster device that springs up a new clone of the player character.
Eventually, this section comes to a close when it's revealed that Farnsworth is unable to repair the ship's dark matter engine. To make matters worse, he pawned off the backup engine to get a gun, which he ends up giving to Fry. This leads to the true beginning of Fry's gameplay, where Fry is forced to head down into the sewers to avoid Mom's death patrol. Unfortunately, this is where the frustrations of the game start to become apparent. The first thing you learn is Fry's weaponry has travel time and lag to it, and I mean it's super slow. Strafing, a common tactic in shooters, is rendered pretty much useless by the time you start firing. The target has already moved out of its way. Your best option ends up being facing the enemy head-on more times than not. The next issue that quickly becomes prevalent is how awful the camera is, especially in a section with close-quarter combat like this. The camera would routinely get stuck on walls or rotate to a super tight angle and make fighting anything nearly impossible at certain times. In the sewers, the combat is somewhat tolerable because most of the main enemies are melee-centric. This gets much worse, however, when gun-wielding enemies are factored into the equation. Futurama the Game can be a little unforgiving at times with its difficulty. For example, it's largely the placement of enemies. During our playthrough, there were multiple times where I would round a corner and get fed a shotgun lunch by enemies with no way to ever really dodge the attack other than by spamming the jump button or wiggling around. Combine that with a twitchy targeting system and you're in for a bad time. This is what I would call a lot of artificial difficulty. It's usually done by cramming enemies in a small area to make things difficult. There isn't really a specific strategy that can be used to combat this, other than attempting to fall back and pick the enemies off one by one. I felt the game utilizes this tactic heavily at the end of missions, as one last curveball to send the player miles back to a checkpoint.
Speaking of the checkpoint gaps, fairly early into the game you'll start encountering kamikaze enemies. In Fry's levels, they're boars with dynamite strapped to them. For some reason, the game loves this type of obstacle. These enemies are especially troublesome in Leela's levels. The kamikaze enemies are purely frustrating extra hits on the player character. This tactic feels cheap, plays cheap, and this type of enemy serves no purpose other than coming out of the woodwork just to almost instantly kill your character and halt your progress so far.
Now by this point in the video, we've jammed in a lot of complaints, but they're definitely warranted. However, I would like to take a quick break to praise one of the few segments in the game that I actually had a lot of fun with. Later on in the game, when you make your way topside, you can find an actual suicide booth in-game. If you've ever seen the pilot of Futurama, then you're already familiar with this fun and infamous gag that introduces Bender in the show for the very first time. I, of course, had to use it, and it actually worked.
Oh, I don't know what I expected.
It ended up wasting a life, but it's the wonderful little things like this that kept pushing me to want to give this game a little bit more time to grow on me. At the end of the new New York level, you go on rails in a MomCorp mech for a shooting sequence, which I admittedly had a lot of fun with. Thankfully, the fun carries over into the next chapter of the game with Bender's levels, which highlight the platforming aspect of the game. During this set of level, the player blazes through the platforming sections to defeat Mom's 3 sons. The combat is a bit repetitive since Bender is limited to only basic melee, but the variety of puzzles and locations in the game make it tolerable. Plus, this section here is home to one of my favorite Easter eggs in the game, which is a clear homage to the jockey from Alien. There is also a runner section at the end, which as an avid fan of runner games like Pepsi Man, I immensely enjoyed. Overall, Bender's chapter was pretty upbeat and left me feeling like we might actually have turned a corner with the game. Then comes Leela's section. For a character as beloved and kick-ass as Leela, you'd think they would give her some of the best sections in the game, but nope, instead you flail around with wimpy kung fu moves a la the Gex games and suffer the eternal heat of the sun. No, literally. Her section of the game is on the sun. Turns out the sun has been inhabitable for all this time, and their chief export is dark matter, which you still conveniently need for your ship. So not only do you get the least amount of diversity in your environment, you also repeatedly go around and lazily activate crystals so you can fight the evil sun god. Oh wait, I'm sorry, it's actually...
I'm just an ordinary, eternal, omniscient, super intelligent being.
Okay, that was actually pretty funny. But you see what I'm talking about? This is the weird enigma of this game. One second I'll be laughing and smiling, and then the next I'm just sitting there all mad and frumpy wanting to throw my controller out the window. You weren't actually expecting me to throw a controller out the window, were you? It doesn't help that Leela's levels are littered with some of the cheapest gags a game can muster. For example, let's take a look at this gag here. Lava is filling the room, and the player is expected to dart across to get to the other side before the path sinks underneath the lava. I'm literally running as fast as Leela can go, and it's still not fast enough. The base running speed isn't enough to beat the puzzle. You have to start jumping diagonally across corners to shave off time. Otherwise, you're not going to make it, and you'll be sent right back to the beginning of the path with lava already filling the room. There's no time to catch your breath if you fail. The Chromie camera once again rears its ugly face during the latter half of Leela's levels too, since they're indoors. The camera would routinely get hung up on the surrounding environment. Not being able to see the instant death traps mixed in with the constant threat of suicide enemies combines for a pretty abysmal experience. And the clincher? A final chapter boss running at a breezy 5 to 10 frames per second, making PowerPoint look like Crysis 3. I could go on for hours about my frustrations with Leela's levels, but I suppose I'll spare you the hassle since the next portion of the game is much more forgiving. After getting the dark matter from the sun, the Planet Express crew travels to the corner of the universe where they meet Farnsworth's mentor, Adoy, who tells them he's invented a time travel device. However, it's currently unable to run under full power to send them far enough back in time to stop Mom. Need someone to power the generator?
Why not Zoidberg?
That's right, Dr. Zoidberg makes a cameo to save the day by running through the swamp on his horse to start up the generator, giving the time machine the required amount of power. Again, this is a runner level, but it's much easier than Bender's running section. The time frame for Zoidberg's level is massive, and you have infinite lives. So after suffering through the grueling Leela chapters, the game finally gives you a bit of reprieve.
The next 3 chapters of the game are actually a bit of a recap. You play, once again, as Bender, Leela, and Fry in that order. Having traveled back in time, you arrive at Planet Express with the damaged ship from the future, thus completing the loop at the beginning that explains why the ship was in shambles to begin with. The crew takes the good ship from the past and crash lands at MomCorp in order to warn the professor not to sign the papers that would sell Planet Express. However, Mom has a trap waiting for the heroes and sends them hurtling down a trap door into the labs below where a massive destructor unit is completing its target practice. Bender and Leela's final levels are really nothing special. If given a grade, we would probably say they're a solid C+. Not as good as Bender's first platforming levels, but not nearly as bad as Leela's whole campaign. Ultimately, each character has mechanics that are practiced throughout the game, which all culminate into Fry's final level. This level also happens to be the final level of the game. Time to vent again, because there were a few things, namely 2 specific glitches, that really hampered our endgame experience.
The first one is this platform puzzle section that you complete as Leela. When you hop on each platform, they activate before falling into a pit shortly after. For some reason, the other side started activating ahead of time, so I doubled back. Turns out the platforms do not respawn, so basically I was trapped until I just decided to jump in the pit and respawn so I can try again. I know this was a bug because the second time I attempted this section, the platforms fell as normal. But that glitch is the runner-up to the dumbest thing I encountered during our Futurama playthrough. All 3 MomCorp levels have a little number puzzle that you have to punch in a sequence of missing numbers and then it'll complete the puzzle and unlock the next section. In this particular case, I punched in the right numbers, but I accidentally clicked another button shortly after it. This resulted in the game playing both the correct and incorrect sound effects. The objective unlocked, but the floor also fell, killing Fry instantly and sending me back in the level. I'm not sure why this had to happen considering I hit the right sequence, but my fat finger evidently overrides the correct code.
Either way, after all of the tedious puzzles and platforming, you finally come to the final boss, the Destructor. Despite a lack of clarification on how exactly to defeat the boss, you're at least given unlimited health and ammunition in the provided shelter, so thankfully you can play conservatively until you have mastered the shooting mechanic. After defeating the Destructor, the game rolls the final cutscene. Igner ends up ruining the reanimator, and the crew gets crushed under the falling body of the Destructor, killing them off for good. Farnsworth attacks Mom and tears the sale contract up, to which Mom makes a counteroffer with a sombrero.
At this point, the present timeline continues with the professor declaring to his alive and well crew, the ones who weren't killed by the Destructor, that he has sold Planet Express to Mom, revealing the game as one big continuous cycle by putting the player back at the opening level and the start of the game once again. This plot twist was actually very funny in typical irreverent Futurama humor, and I could finally smile again. Not because I was happy and ready to replay the game, but it was more so the catharsis of knowing that Futurama the Game was finally over.
In all, the phrase we kept using to describe Futurama the Game was, "I really want to like this, but..." It's really too bad that the gameplay tanks the experience that is Futurama the Game. I can't sing the game's praises enough when it comes to design aesthetics, the plot of the game, and its success in capturing the whole Futurama essence. I love how the game expands upon places that aren't typically seen in the Futurama series, like the fleshed out version of the Red Light District and Zoidberg's Bogad Swamp Trail. Though these areas were new to the game, they didn't feel like filler levels, unlike the many filler levels present in other licensed games. These two locations, amidst others, felt like places that actually belonged in the Futurama universe, and they were a welcome addition to the familiar places already in the game. The cutscenes from Futurama the Game, as well as samples of the gameplay, would eventually be spliced together and released as one coherent lost episode as a bonus feature on the DVD release of Beast with a Billion Backs, 5 years later in 2008. In my opinion, if the creators of the show deemed the plot of the game worthy enough to eventually be released as a standalone episode, then the episode is most definitely worth watching. I highly recommend at least watching this lost episode in some capacity, because, come on, it is a new, old episode of Futurama after all. In summary, if you're a fan of Futurama, we still wouldn't necessarily recommend this game, especially at the high price point that Futurama the Game currently fetches in the secondhand game markets. There are just too many glitches and difficult for difficult's sake moments for us to recommend the game on gameplay alone. However, I would say that devoted fans should at least check out Futurama the Game for the hilarious original plot, as well as for the depth and expansion of the Futurama canon that the game provides.
So if you're gonna play Futurama the Game, good luck, meatbags. You're gonna need it.
You watched it. You can't unwatch it. Stay tuned for more Tales of Interest.